Welcome to Israel's 9/11, the Hamas-Israel war, a pause in the war, unknown paths forward, sponsored by the Center for Israel Education in Atlanta. This is the 8th webinar in our ongoing series. Our center's mission remains to educate and inform broadly the general public on all aspects of modern Israel, including international relations, Israeli society and identity, Zionist and Israeli history, culture, and more. Core to our work is the use of documents and sources, be they in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. We want to make materials available that otherwise are not easily accessible on our Center for Israel Education website. We're an independent 501c entity that exists because listeners like you like what they read, like what they see, like what they hear, and sometimes they press a donate button to assist us. Joining us today are three highly talented analysts and scholars, Dr. Stephen Bayme, Dr. Mark Heller, and Dr. Meir Litvak. Today, by coincidence, is the 76th anniversary of the United Nations Partition Plan, the idea that there would be created in Palestine an Arab and a Jewish state. That was November 29th, 1947. There was supposed to be an economic union between those two states. Both states were to establish a constitution, and we can always play the what if, considering where we are today in the history of the Middle East and the history of Arab-Israeli relations. What if there had been an Arab state alongside the Jewish state? We know that the Arab world and the Palestinians rejected wholeheartedly any presence of Zionism or a Jewish state in the area of the Palestine Mandate. Today, we'll start the discussion with an overview of the region, and then we'll focus on Israel and the reactions, both in Israel and across the world, not the least of which has been the anti-Semitic responses, which we've seen on campuses and in many public forums. On October 7th, that Sabbath morning, several thousand Hamas terrorists poured across Israel's border with the Gaza Strip, burned and murdered more than 1,300 Israelis and others, and took some 239 hostages. This past week, some 20 to 25% of them have been released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, and that followed a pause in the fighting between Israel and Hamas. We don't know how long that pause will last. We don't know how many more hostages will be released. We're told perhaps 10 a day for every day that there is a pause. Mark, can you provide us sort of an overview of the region in the last 7 weeks? If you want to include Iran, that would be quite useful, I think, to our audience.
First of all, I think you cannot seriously address regional contexts without referring to Iran, because I think it is critical, even central, to many of the developments that have taken place and are taking place. In the larger scheme of things, in fact, I think that up until now, there was a trend for countries to divide themselves into those which are trying to resist what they see as Iranian aggression and Iranian subversion, and those who are either allied with it, subject to it, or trying to buy protection from it. And one of the consequences of that is that, as we know, over the last year or two, there has been a kind of rapprochement between Israel and some of those, I guess moderate is not an unreasonable term, Arab countries, which were at least as concerned as Israel is about the Iranian threat to them. That kind of rapprochement is something that, in a sense, shunted the Palestinian issue aside. And in many respects, I think, fed into Hamas decision-making with respect to the campaign of atrocities that it launched on October 7th. In fact, there are those who insist that this was calculated to upset or distract from that trend and undermine the tendency of an anti-Iranian camp in the region to coalesce. And more specifically, with respect to Hamas and Iran, I think what we have learned is that we have spent too much time and intellectual effort focusing on what we think are Hamas intentions or aspirations, and not enough focusing on Hamas capabilities. And I think it's not possible to look at Hamas capabilities, and particularly to think about any possible future development of Hamas capabilities, without looking at the role that Iran has played in general, and in particular the relationship between Hamas and Iran. And one might even come to the conclusion that it won't be possible to either eliminate Hamas capabilities or ensure that they are not restored without something being done to constrain Iran as well.
When this war unfolded on October 7th, Iran probably had some inkling that it might be unfolding. We don't know to what degree. So far as the war has gone, do you think Iran has achieved whatever goals it wanted in comparison to Hamas or alongside Hamas?
Iran, first of all, is elated by what happened, unfortunately, on October 7th and ever since. Now, if we have to look at the Iranian strategy before, by the way, I fully concur with what Mark said. The ideological position of Iran is that Israel has to be eliminated, but Iran is not a country to do so. Iran's goal and role is to provide the Palestinians, the Arabs, and other Muslims the means to bleed Israel and eventually lead Israel to its destruction. Therefore, Iran systematically had supplied Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah with weapons, technology, know-how, money, training, intelligence, etc., to fight Israel without Iran paying any price for it or paying with Iranian blood. The Iranians claim that they were not informed in advance on the exact day of the attack. They probably had a general notion about the future attack. Several months ago, there were high-level meetings in Beirut between representatives of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah in Lebanon of what they call unity of the fronts against Israel. That is, that they should coordinate their activities. I don't know to which details they reached, but Iran claims that they were not in the know before the attack took place, which then, by the way, gives them the excuse why they do not join the fighting. We were surprised, so we couldn't. I would say that Iran preserves Hezbollah, its main arm, as a deterrence against potential Israeli attack on Iran, and therefore they are not happy to waste or squander Hezbollah capabilities right now in the fight against Israel. But when Iran sees that Hamas had managed to cause severe casualties to Israel, humiliate Israel, inflict severe damage to Israel's position, Israel deterrence, etc., all the Iranians can do is enjoy themselves and say, we told you so. Our strategy is the correct one, and we have been proven right. Not those softy Arabs who make peace with the Jews.
Would you explain who is Hezbollah, who is Nasrallah, and what exactly is their relationship, or how they would define their relationship with Iran?
Hezbollah emerged as a militia or a movement of Shiites in Lebanon. I would say it's a combination of two processes. One, radical elements who had been influenced by the Iranian ideology, by the Iranian revolution, and wanted to implement the revolution in Lebanon. And the Israeli foolish invasion to Lebanon in 1982 served as a catalyst to the formation of Hezbollah. Hezbollah then emerged as a militia fighting Israel's presence in Lebanon. They received support from Iran from the beginning. Now, Hezbollah relations with Iran are very close. If you look at Hezbollah's websites and posters, etc., they have pictures of Khomeini and Khamenei, and they say they are our supreme leaders. Deputy chief said openly, we need to get Iranian permission for every major strategic decision that we make. I mean, Iran does not get involved in tactics, but all major important political, military decisions are done in consultation with Iran, and we need permission of Iran. Hezbollah's general secretary, Hassan Nasrallah, regards himself as a representative, what they call wakil, of Iranian supreme leader Khamenei. If you look at it symbolically, you can see that when Nasrallah visited Iran, he would kiss Khamenei's hand. This is a sign of submission. I am at your service.
Hamas's relationship with Iran and Hezbollah, if you could comment on that, Mark?
Well, that's a little bit more complex. Hezbollah was basically created by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps during the First Lebanon War. And in many respects is, if not a wholly owned subsidiary, at least an extension in many respects of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Hamas is an entirely different kettle of fish in the sense that it is an authentic indigenous Palestinian phenomenon. It is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brethren, originally split off during the first Intifada, basically because it thought that Fatah at that time had become too soft and moderate and wanted to institute a more violent resistance to Israel. If you remember, Fatah at the time was playing around with ideas about changing its charter and possibly doing some kind of interim deals with Israel and what have you. Hamas wanted none of that. Hamas is totally and unequivocally dedicated to the destruction of Israel, in keeping with the revolutionary tradition of the Muslim Brethren, which was a very powerful force in Egypt. In fact, some argue the Muslim Brothers drove Egypt into the war against Israel in 1948. Being a Palestinian organization, it is largely, if not exclusively, a Sunni organization. And that became a problem during the Syrian civil war, when Hezbollah and Iran took the side of the regime, almost made Assad an honorary Shia, and were perceived as being responsible for the oppression, repression, and mass murder of Syrian Sunnis. It was difficult for a Sunni movement like Hamas to associate itself with those forces. The enmity between them only began to diminish and decline after the end of the Syrian civil war. And when that happened, they were able to kind of reassemble based on what was a common interest, which is the destruction of Israel, and particularly for Hamas to be willing, indeed eager, to benefit from any assistance that Iran was willing and able to provide based on its own regional interests.
Fast forward to the past week, past 10 days, there's a pause in the fighting. There's been an exchange of prisoners. And in that pause, in that exchange of prisoners, there's been relief aid that's gone on to Gaza, to the citizenry of the Strip. If you're the leader of Hamas, what is your objective or objectives in trying to achieve this ceasefire? What is your long-term goal vis-a-vis Israel?
You can't get to the long term without going through the short term. The short-term goal is to survive, which is to say, using whatever means it can to force Israel to stay its hand. And that includes, of course, manipulation of the hostage issue, plus a fairly sophisticated campaign of propaganda, public diplomacy, manipulation of hostility to Israel in the outside world, or naivete, or even in some cases, genuine empathy for the Palestinian victims of the military operations in Gaza. All of that is geared towards getting Israel to refrain, to hold back, not to pursue its military campaign through to the end, which is the destruction of Hamas's capability to harm Israel.
It wants to buy time.
It wants to buy time. It wants to buy life.
Meir, give us a brief understanding of where the anti-Semitism from Iran comes from and how that is projected or how that is infused to outside communities in the Middle East.
The anti-Semitism in Iran is rooted to some extent in Shiite tradition, which was usually more hostile to Jews than Sunni tradition. For instance, in Shiite tradition, Jews were regarded as ritually unclean, which carried all kinds of discriminations against Jews. There were also a few cases of pogroms against Jews and forced conversion to Islam, which is different from most Sunni countries. Add to that the modern Islamist ideology articulated by, in Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, which basically spoke of one thing as Jewish war against Islam from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, one thing, and joint Jewish Western alliance against Islam. The Jews and the West fight Islam. The Jews and the West want to destroy Islam because Islam is the barrier that blocks their taking over of the world, and they want to prevent Islam from fulfilling its historical mission. And Zionism in this regard is the culmination of the Jewish Western offensive conspiracy against Islam. And therefore it is so dangerous. They, of course, do not make any distinction between Jews and Zionism. Zionism is simply the implementation of Judaism.
You use the word unjust, that Zionism and Israel are unjust. Can you explain what that might mean?
The Jews do not deserve statehood because the Jews have rejected the Prophet Muhammad. Therefore, the Jews were punished by God to be dispersed and humiliated among the nations. The very notion of Jewish sovereignty, the very notion of Jewish statehood is a revolt against Islam. It is a revolt against the proper cosmic order where Islam should be on top and Jews should be subordinate to Islam. Therefore, the Jews in their claim for statehood rebel against God. The Jews become the enemies of God. And if you are the enemy of God, then you have only one deserved punishment.
Elimination.
Elimination.
Steve, you've tracked diaspora-Israel relations and you've tracked anti-Semitism for 4 decades. When this explosion occurred on campuses and in the public square against Israel's use of force against Hamas, what was your immediate reactions to the intensity or to the frequency as compared to other kinds of anti-Semitic outbursts that you may have seen or you might have experienced in a previous period of time?
Frankly, my reaction was only perhaps 1 degree less surprised by the reaction than I was by the events of October 7th. In other words, the Saturday of October 7th was incredible shock, never imagining such a thing could happen. But almost equally so, I could never have imagined that the response would be one of such hostility, intensity, vitriol, even anti-Jewish violence. So in that respect, the initial reaction was one of enormous shock. I think in terms of the college campus in particular, this was shocking to most American Jews. Not that we hadn't seen hostility on the campus before, but the intensity of it, the vitriol, simply the widespreadness of it. You could count easily dozens of campuses that had disturbances. One needs to put that in the context that a counter narrative had been growing on campus for years. That did not start yesterday. With the counter reaction by Israel in terms of the Gaza Strip, that reaction intensified and became concretized as a very, very hostile one. It shatters 2 myths of American Jewry, notwithstanding that we'd experienced some of this in the years leading up to it. One myth was that education would cure anti-Semitism. One of the things perhaps we should have learned a long time ago is that education is hardly an antidote to the poison of anti-Semitism. Education can go in many different ways. And certainly we've seen that not just in public discourse, but even in some of the most elite centers of education imaginable. Secondly, I think particularly dismaying and depressing is that American Jews had placed so much of their faith in the university campus as the institution of upward mobility, of becoming fully accepted citizens of America, as the entry points into the centers of American power and influence. So in that respect, the relationship between American Jewry and the university system was one of a love affair. When a love affair goes sour, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, to paraphrase Shakespeare. When that love affair went south, the reaction was one of enormous sadness, enormous depression.
Mark, I guess you were equally astonished by what you saw and what you heard. What was your feeling about it and what might be done about it?
Well, I wish I could say I was equally astonished, but the truth is I wasn't really, particularly with respect to the campuses. I had a vague inkling, at least, of what's been going on in institutions of higher education in North America and Western Europe for a couple of decades now, ever since, contrary to my sense of sanity, Edward Said became a best-selling author. Edward Said passed himself off as a Palestinian intellectual, but he grew up in Egypt, and he was a Christian. A lot of Palestinians wouldn't have considered it authentically Palestinian, but he made a good case for arguing that Palestine was a dimension of the greater conflict between the Western world and the global South. And in a sense, he was the intellectual godfather of this whole fad of intersectionality, which people bought into for reasons which are quite beyond me, apart from ignorance. And therefore, what we have is, I think, yes, a lot of anti-Semitism, but also a lot of Islamists and a lot of Arabs waging their campaign against Israel in Western intellectual circles. There's been quite a significant growth in the Islamic and Arab population in Western Europe and North America in recent decades. And finally, I really have no other word for it, the idiocy of progressive liberalism. I'm reminded when I see what goes on in some of the college campuses now of what George Orwell once said about how some things are so absurd only an academic would believe them. It's quite striking. Look, this vitriolic hatred of Israel did not start when the casualty figures went up in Gaza. This was not just humanitarians who were really genuinely hurt by the sight of Palestinian casualties. This started the day after October 7th. It started October the 8th. There was a lot of instances of celebration of the uprising of the oppressed against the oppressor. So I think a lot of this in college campuses has to do with a fashion, with a trend, with people jumping on this so-called intellectual bandwagon. And why they picked this one is a little bit beyond me, except maybe for the suppressed anti-Semitism. It's not just humanitarian concern. Assad killed 500,000 Syrians, Muslims. I never saw a single demonstration in London or New York or Melbourne or whatever. The Sudanese have killed hundreds of thousands of Muslims, and the Pakistanis are getting ready to deport almost 2 million homeless Afghans. Nobody cares about this. So the reason why they care about it is because Israel's doing it, not because of who it's being done to. And frankly, that kind of irrational hatred makes me kind of despair that I, at least, can answer your question, what can be done about it. I'm not sure anything can be done about it, Ken.
Over the years, Stephen, organizations like the American Jewish Committee, which you worked for, and you're not wearing the mantle of responsibility here. I must say that your tenure there was quite extraordinary, and you made a major contribution to American Jewish understanding of the diaspora and of anti-Semitism. But one of the efforts on the behalf of American Jews was to create alliances across the United States with non-Jews, and to understand that if you have friends and if you have allies and they understand your point of view and you can understand theirs. October 7th blew a hole, a massive hole through those alliances. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not repairable, but the number of people who jumped out in front and said, Israel's to blame, Israel's responsible, Israel caused October 7th, was really unheard of from voices like this. Any explanation that can be given to it, or any lesson to be learned from what we thought over time were folks who understood what Israel stood for, even if she had warts?
Thank you for your kind remarks about my tenure there. HAC's official position throughout my 4 decades there was that we seek alliances or coalitions only when it's in the enlightened self-interest of the Jewish people whom we're defending. So in that respect, the official position was not based in mythology or illusions. It was rather based in a rather hard-headed realism that there are times when we will seek out groups on the right, sometimes we'll seek out groups on the left. Perhaps my criticism, not of the official position, but rather of the implementation of it, was that the natural home for, say, 80-85% of American Jews was center-leaning left, by and large excluding the Orthodox. In that context, it was a lot more comfortable to seek out alliances among groups that shared a common vision of what society should look like, based on social justice, based on equality, based on all the lovely terms, I think, that Mark referred to earlier. Oftentimes, we lack the capacity to be sufficiently hard-nosed about it and say that, yes, we might agree with you in principle on A, B, and C, but we really have major conflicts on areas D, E, and F. So that, I think, was one of the problems in terms of not just HAC, but Jewish communal relations generally. And in that respect, it's not just October 7th, but really the entire course of non-Jewish reaction to what might be called Israeli actions that appeared to be aggressive, if you will. The theory of Jewish communal relations was that of we continue plugging away, build relations, build bridges, never give up, And in that respect, I think it's a fair criticism to say that some of the assumptions were mistaken. Now, the most critical assumption, though, is something I think Mark only alluded to in the concept of progressive liberalism. I would prefer to use the term liberal imagination in the sense that it is not necessarily a political statement. By liberal imagination, I mean the commonly held view that if I treat you fairly, you'll treat me fairly. That people are basically good, that give them a good deal and they'll reciprocate. One of the lessons we need to learn, to put it into rather blunt, harsh terms, is that there's a lot more sin in the world than the liberal imagination would have us believe. American Jews probably have been the chief consumers of the liberal imagination. And we're discovering with, I think, a good deal of dismay and disappointment that not only doesn't it always work, but sometimes you pay a very heavy price for buying into it. Certainly with the case of Hamas, to put it into very pragmatic, practical terms, there were those within the Jewish community who for years have called for outreach to Hamas, negotiations. They did not pay any attention to the Hamas covenant. They did not pay any attention to the religious underpinnings, the religious zealotry that underlay Hamas's, or the Muslim Brotherhood's approach to Jews and Judaism. In that sense, yes, this is somewhat of a wake-up call. Were I at AJC today, I certainly would say, let's take a look at all of our alliances and coalitions. Some of them will be binding and valid and sustaining. Others, we need to say, what went wrong here? And why did that coalition become more of a one-way street than a two-way street?
I agree with Steve about the kind of excessive or unjustifiable belief in the goodness of people, but I think there's also an underestimation of the power of ignorance. I'm not sure how much education of university students could get them to understand the meaning of the words they throw around thoughtlessly, mindlessly. They have no idea what apartheid is. They have no idea what genocide is. They have no idea what ethnic cleansing is. They have no idea of the historical facts of this situation. The reality escapes them. The most absurd example I think I saw was coverage at one of the colleges in the US, somebody holding up a big sign that said, "Gays for Hamas." The next thing I expect to see is chickens for Colonel Sander. It's just mind-boggling, the ignorance that plays into this whole dynamic. And I think sometimes these kids go with the flow, whatever the fad or style happens to be. You denounce Israel, you put holes in your jeans, you go to a Taylor Swift concert, whatever's going on, that's what they do.
The question I'd like to move back to is how Israeli society has reacted, both welding together to help those who have been displaced and those who have faced trauma, and at the same time remaining divided on certain issues. Can you throw some light on what you've seen over the last 7 weeks inside Israel?
Maybe the one single word that best encapsulates it is outrage. Outrage, of course, first of all, at the Palestinian Hamas. Second of all, the rest of the world, with maybe the exception of Joe Biden, that treats Israel the way it does. And thirdly, outrage at the behavior and incompetence of the Israeli government as well. This one in particular, but previous ones as well. And I'd like to backtrack for a second and refer to something that Steve said about how among this whole cacophony of hostility and opposition to Israel, there are some who say, look, actually it's Israel's fault, Israel's to blame. To a certain extent, there's a kernel of truth in there as well. We can't say that Israel is entirely innocent or blameless for the dynamic that has developed between Israel and the Palestinians. But let's leave that aside. You asked, what's the mood? The mood is one of now of outrage and a feeling of desire for revenge. I don't think I can put a more subtle term for it than revenge. We can get even with these guys, but constrained and complicated by the unity and solidarity with respect to the question of hostages. If it were up to Israelis, they would say, we want to smash Hamas, public opinion, I mean. We want to smash Hamas to smithereens, and we want to get all the hostages back. There are TV analysts, a dime a dozen, saying that these two objectives are complementary. I don't think they are. I don't think they are. I think there's something of a contradiction here, maybe an impossible contradiction to resolve, and some very difficult and even tragic decisions will have to be made. I do not believe that it is possible for Israel to abandon the hostages, no matter what, which is why Hamas is so effective at manipulating Israeli emotions on this issue. I also do not think it is possible for Israel to allow Hamas to continue to have any capability to harm it. Look at what's happened. Aside from the people who have been killed, the economy is paralyzed. A couple of 100,000 people are not living in their homes anymore. The foreign workers who underpin the agricultural and construction industries have run away. You don't know if and when they'll be able to come back. And as long as Hamas continues to exist as an organization which has some capacity to harm Israel, those issues will not be resolved. So there's a contradiction here. I don't know how you resolve it.
One of the questions from one of the attendees is, can you educate people away from anti-Semitism? Is it insufficient knowledge, or is it just a prejudice which you happen to imbibe at an early age and you just don't get rid of it? I don't understand, for example, living here in Georgia for 40 plus years, why there are still flags in people's kitchen that reflect Civil War America. And then I asked someone, they said, well, that's what my father believed, and that's what his father believed, and that's what my son believes. I don't know that there's necessarily an analogy between the two.
The reason why a lot of people may think that education provides a possible solution to this problem is because one of the most renowned anti-Semites in the world today was made famous by singing this song that said, "We don't need no education." I guess they think, yeah, if you get some education, you won't be an anti-Semite anymore. But education covers a multitude of sins, and there are a lot of permeable borders between education and brainwashing and indoctrination, and who knows what kind of education you're talking about. I think people who get educated in the liberal arts, in social sciences, and Western colleges and universities are not getting a lot of knowledge, and they're certainly not getting much education.
The only thing I can say is I received from a colleague an outline which came from someone in one of the counties near here that was about as anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian as one could possibly have. And it was sent through the school system by a person who was responsible for diversity, equity, and I forgot what the I stands for.
Yeah, it's DEI, and it's a lot of hogwash.
But what happens is you can put the school system's name on it as if it has some sort of stamp of approval, and it comes from an individual. And I've seen it in public schools, I've seen it in private schools, I've seen it on American campuses for 40 years. I want to ask Stephen to maybe give a final thought about the level of anti-Semitism and how does that tone down? I mean, I know there's no pill you can take. I know you can't take 2 pills and wake up in the morning and you're no longer an anti-Semite.
First of all, there's a great deal of internal education within the Jewish community about who we are, what we stand for, what we believe in. In that respect, the work that you've been doing at the Center for Israel Education is of enormous consequence. If people don't know what it is that they believe in and what they stand for, they are essentially only inviting more myths, more stereotypes to be thrown out at them. So the first thing, and to me the most important thing, is internal self-education. Create proud Jews who know what they're all about, who identify with Israel. Israel is far from being perfect. But again, in a complicated world, ask a gay person, would you rather live in Israel or in Syria or Egypt or Gaza or wherever? So there's a definite need to look internally inside the Jewish community and raise the level of education there. Second, the Jewish community, and I alluded to this earlier, we need to have no illusions about where anti-Semitism is coming from. It's easy to talk about white supremacy because no one likes racism. We should be opposed to racism. It's much harder to talk about anti-Semitism coming from the left. One of the most important books, I think, written when I was in graduate school was the late Arthur Hertzberg's French Enlightenment and the Jews, which basically argued, I think, quite succinctly and cogently, that whatever your beliefs are about the values of enlightenment, and they're quite considerable, don't think that there's not sufficient anti-Semitism on the left in the most enlightened of circles that it's going to come back and haunt you in terms of the position of Jews in general society. So secondly, I think there's a need for realism about where anti-Semitism is coming from. Thirdly, we need to hold administrations responsible for what takes place, especially on the college campus. University presidents have become incredibly timid about speaking out on issues of the day, obviously for political reasons of not offending one or another constituency. On the other hand, they have their own freedom of speech, if you will. They have their own academic freedom. They have the right to articulate positions. But by failing to take leadership on these kinds of issues, it only allows it more and more to fester. We had this terrible incident at a high school in Queens, New York, just the last couple of weeks, where a teacher attended a pro-Israel rally. She put it on Facebook that she was there, and she suffered an incredible backlash, rioting, picketing of her classroom by a band of 400 students. What most amazed me was that the chancellor of the school system, instead of saying, this is anti-Semitism, said, it's a bunch of kids doing what kids do. In other words, he trivialized it. Now, in that sense, we've got to hold authorities responsible, whether they are university presidents, whether they are educational authorities, whether they are governmental authorities. Again, none of this will be a cure. Anti-Semitism has been in existence in every society which Jews have lived in, and even in some societies they've not lived in. The question is, what triggers it into a serious phenomenon? America was blessed that anti-Semitism was not terribly serious after World War II till the end of the 20th century. But now we're looking at something that really has become very serious. We can't afford to ignore it. And we also know there's no cure, but there are ways of lessening the tempo, lessening the temperature, and holding people accountable.
Lessening the tempo, holding people accountable, that's a good way to close. Let me briefly state that the last 2 days of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune, there's a 2-part series on anti-Semitism on campus and Middle Eastern studies and Israel studies, which I put together for them. It may be worthwhile for people to take a look at the historical process under which this anti-Israel feeling evolved on American campuses and how it's tied back into the anti-Zionism of the earlier part of the 20th century and the opposition to the very creation of the state. I want to thank you for your insights, for your candor. You provide so many wonderful thoughts, and not always do you have the answers, and you acknowledge that. But it was terrific having you. We're going to have another webinar next Wednesday at the same time. I think the focus this time will be more directed at American foreign policy in particular. And if you like what you see and you like what you hear, go to the website and help us do more of what we're doing.